I want to get this right because people keep getting it wrong. The Volkai did not choose me because I am brave. They did not choose me because I am exceptional, or because I carry some quality of spirit that predators can smell at 100 yards, or because the universe has a preference for symmetry, and thought it poetic to match a widower from the inner rim with 600 pounds of apex pack hunter on a dust shelf at the edge of settled space. I want to be very clear about this before I tell you what actually happened, because once you hear it you will be tempted to build it into something it was not. I am a farmer. I am 44 years old. My hands are rough and I sleep badly, and I burned the same pot of lentils 4 times in a single week the autumn my son left for the academy, and I once spent 2 hours trying to fix a broadcast relay anchor before my neighbor pointed out it was working the entire time, and I had simply been adjusting the wrong unit. I am not remarkable. I am not apex anything. What I am is quiet. That, as best I can reconstruct it, is the whole explanation. Dust Shelf Station sits at grid mark 7-14 on the Outer Rim resettlement charts, which is a way of saying it sits in the middle of a long stretch of nothing bordered on the east by more nothing, and on the west by a rift grass plain that runs unbroken for 80 kilometers until it hits the Theron Bluffs. The station has 1,200 permanent colonists, a Territorial Authority office with 4 staff members, and a very large sense of its own importance. 1 commissary, 1 medical bay, 1 school that doubles as a community hall on the 3 annual feast days, and approximately 1,700 Volkai distributed across the rift grass flats and the scrub ridge above the bluffs. I learned the number from the resettlement packet they gave me on the transit ship. The packet was 46 pages, and the Volkai section was 41 of them. I remember thinking that was either a very good sign or a very bad one. The Volkai are what the station's original xenobiological survey called a functionally apex cursorial pack predator, which is a careful way of saying they are large, fast, highly intelligent, and they hunt in organized groups. They look, at a distance, something like a wolf crossed with an animal that has never seen a wolf, and arrived at a similar design through a completely different evolutionary chain. They run on 6 limbs, the front 2 of which can brace upright when they choose to sit or observe, giving them a posture that reads as almost deliberate, almost watchful, in a way that makes the back of your neck prickle when you first see it. Their coats are short and dense, ranging from the color of old iron to a blue-gray that disappears into rift grass shadow at dusk, with a completeness that I later came to find deeply inconvenient. Adults weigh between 80 and 120 kilograms. The juveniles, which the station documentation called cubs though they were not particularly cub-like in any way that implied harmlessness, ranged from 20 to 40 kilograms, and had the same 6-limb layout and the same watchful posture in miniature. The station documentation described them as aggressive when approached, territorial when provoked, and historically unresponsive to standard bonding protocols used for analogous species on other resettlement worlds. Which is a careful way of saying 80 years of colonists had tried to befriend them, and all of them had failed, and several had been significantly hurt in the attempt. I was not trying to befriend them. I want to be clear about that too. I arrived at Dust Shelf on the 43rd resettlement batch, which is a polite way of saying I arrived late. My wife Carol had been the one with the ambition for frontier settlement. She had researched stations, drawn up comparison tables, identified Dust Shelf specifically for its combination of soil quality, light-year proximity to the nearest relay hub, and what she called genuine frontier character, which I understood to mean it was far enough out that the land was still worth farming and close enough to civilization that our son would not grow up without access to a proper school. We had been on the waiting list for 3 years when she died. I stayed on the list because I did not know what else to do, and because our son Mavi was 14 and had inherited his mother's specific, unsentimental way of looking at a problem and deciding what the correct answer was, And the correct answer Mavi had arrived at was that we were still going. So we went. Mavi was 17 by the time the placement came through. He spent 2 weeks at Dust Shelf helping me unload and set up and then left for the academy, because that too had been Carol's plan, the frontier for Roots, the academy for Reach. And Mavi was not the sort of person to abandon a plan just because the person who made it was gone. He held my hand at the transit shuttle the way he had not done since he was 8, quickly and without ceremony, and then he was on it. I watched the shuttle climb until it was a point of light among the station's orbital markers. I was left with 40 hectares of rift grass-bordered farmland, one small prefabricated house that smelled of sealant compound, and the particular institutional cleanliness of a space that had been prepared for a human being, but had not yet had one in it, a commissary account in good standing, and more quiet than I had experienced in 17 years of marriage. The house had 2 bedrooms, and I used one of them for storage. The kitchen window looked east, which meant the mornings came through it, and I learned quickly that the mornings were the easiest time and tried to be in the kitchen for them. The Voakai were already there when I arrived, not at my plot specifically, at first. My plot bordered the eastern Riftgrass Flat, which was designated Zone 3 in the Territorial Authority's management maps, and Zone 3 was the pack's primary ranging territory from the Theron Bluffs to the station perimeter. The documentation said to keep my perimeter lights on at dusk, to avoid leaving processed protein uncovered outside, and to contact the Territorial Authority immediately if I observed any Voakai within 50 meters of the farmstead. The first morning I was there, I woke before dawn because I always wake before dawn, and I walked out to the plot edge with a cup of something that was attempting to be coffee and watched the sun come up over the rift grass. The rift grass at that hour is the color of nothing in particular, a gray-green that absorbs the pre-dawn light without reflecting it, dense and low, and moving in the ground-level wind that comes off the bluffs before the air warms. It smells like water and soil, and something sharper underneath that I could not place until the 3rd week, at which point I understood it was the pack's scent marking from the territorial boundary runs they did at night. At the edge of the grass, maybe 30 meters away, one of them was sitting. Not moving, not making any sound I could hear, just sitting on its 4 lower limbs with its 2 upper limbs braced at the front, watching me watch it. Its coat was the blue-gray of the documentation's description, and in the pre-dawn half-light it was almost invisible against the grass. I had been looking at the bluffs before I looked at the grass, and when I finally looked at the grass, she was already there, already mid-observation, as if she had been sitting for some time before I noticed her. I stood there for a while, then I drank my coffee, then I went back inside and checked the documentation, which confirmed that yes, this was exactly the situation I was supposed to report to the Territorial Authority. I did not report it. I am not sure I can fully explain why. Part of it was that the animal had not done anything. Part of it was that reporting it felt like an overreaction to being watched. Part of it was that I had been watched by my own conscience every morning for the past 2 years, and had developed a tolerance for uncomfortable observation. I went back out the next morning with 2 cups of coffee because the only person who ever saw me be sentimental was already 3 systems away at the academy, and I drank both of them myself while the same animal, or I assumed it was the same one. It sat in the same spot, watched from the grass edge. I held the second cup in my right hand and let the warmth of it sit in my palm longer than I needed to and watched the bluffs turn gold as the sun cleared them. And the animal watched me watch the bluffs. And it was the first morning in a long time where I was not aware at every moment of the specific dimensions of my aloneness. On the 4th morning I sat down on the ground rather than standing, because my back had been bothering me from the initial unloading work, and standing for a long time made it worse. The Voakai watched me sit down. Then, after a long pause that I would estimate at about 4 minutes, it sat down too. I did not tell anyone about this, not because I was hiding anything, but because I was not sure it meant what I might have wanted it to mean, and I had learned in the past 2 years that wanting something to mean something is not the same as it meaning it. I kept farming. I kept waking up before dawn. The rift grass had to be cleared from the eastern third of the plot before I could prepare the soil, and clearing rift grass is one of those tasks that punishes impatience. It goes deep, it binds, and if you cut it at the wrong point in the root system, it grows back in 6 weeks, and you do the whole thing again. I was careful about it. The animal kept showing up, and over the course of the next 3 weeks I learned several things about it by simple observation. It was the smallest of the adults I eventually saw in the distance on the rift grass flat. A female, I thought, though the sexual dimorphism in the documentation was described as subtle enough that I was not confident. She had a slight unevenness in her gait on the right rear set of limbs, nothing that seemed to impair her, just a characteristic movement pattern that let me identify her from a distance once I knew to look for it. She arrived consistently at the same point in the dawn hour, which was consistent with the territorial boundary run timing the documentation described. She left consistently when the sun had fully cleared the bluffs, which was also consistent. Between arrival and departure, she sat and watched me, and I sat or stood and watched the field and drank my coffee. On the 22nd day, I brought a piece of salt-cured dried meat outside with me. I had no particular intention with it. I had been eating it while I worked the previous evening and had brought the remainder outside in my pocket out of habit. I sat down at the plot edge with my coffee. The animal sat down in her usual spot. I ate the dried meat slowly, because it was the kind of thing you eat slowly or not at all, and partway through it occurred to me to set a piece on the ground a few meters in front of me. I did not hold it out. I did not move toward her. I set it on the ground the way you put a cup down on a table, without ceremony, without expectation, and went back to watching the field. She did not take it. She looked at it, and then she looked at me, and then she looked at the grass. I went back inside. When I came back out an hour later, it was gone, but that might have been something else entirely, and I was careful not to attach significance to it. This was, I think, the sum total of what I did to cause everything that happened afterward. I was quiet. I sat down. I did not approach. I did not attempt to establish contact in any of the ways the documentation described, which the documentation acknowledged were all unsuccessful anyway. I just went about my mornings and let her go about hers, and somewhere in the 2nd month the space between those two things got smaller without either of us closing it. By the end of the 2nd month, she was sitting at 10 meters. Not every morning. Some mornings she did not appear at all, and those mornings I went about my routine the same way I did when she was present, which is to say I drank my coffee and looked at the field and thought about what needed doing. But the morning she was there, she was closer. I did not measure this deliberately. I noticed it the way you notice that a season has changed, not on a specific day, but by the cumulative weight of days. The morning she crossed the 10-meter mark, she was close enough that I could hear her breathing. I stayed very still. Not because I was afraid. I was, a little in the way that any reasonable person is a little afraid of a 100-kilogram predator, sitting close enough that you can hear it exhale. But mostly because I have found in my life that when something delicate is happening, stillness is usually the correct response. I could see the texture of her coat in proper detail for the first time. The way the short, dense fur shifted from blue-gray at the back to a slightly warmer tone at the chest and around the upper limb joints. The way it layered in the early light so that she looked, from the right angle, like something cut from the landscape itself. Her eyes were a yellow amber that the documentation had mentioned, and that the documentation had not prepared me for, alert and still at the same time, full of something that I was not equipped to name. She made a sound. It was nothing like what the documentation described. The documentation described Volkai vocalizations in threat-adjacent situations as a low, sustained resonance, often mistaken for mechanical vibration. What she produced was quieter than that and more regular, a sound with a cadence to it, like a piece of machinery running smoothly rather than straining. I had no reference for it. I did not know what to call it then, and I still do not know what to call it now, 6 months later, though I have heard it from all of them in various configurations, and understand something about when they produce it without being able to say exactly what that something is. I did not touch her. I want to be clear about that. I did not reach out. I did not offer my hand. I did not do any of the things the documentation had suggested colonists had tried. I sat still with my second cup of coffee, and she sat close enough that I could have touched her if I had reached. And after about 20 minutes she got up and walked back to the rift grass and disappeared into it in the way they do. Not abruptly, not with any signal of departure, just present and then not present, the grass closing behind her as if she had not been there at all. The following morning there were 3 of them. The other 2 were larger, the 2 largest adults I had seen in the pack when I could sometimes spot them moving at the edge of the rift grass in the late afternoon, the ones I thought of as the senior pair because of the way the others adjusted their movement when these 2 moved. They did not sit as close as she did. They sat at the grass edge, the same distance she had used in the first weeks, and they watched me with the same quality of attention, total and without apparent judgment, simply observation. She sat at 7 meters. I sat with my coffee and watched the sun come up and let the 3 of them do whatever they were doing, and when I stood to go back to work they watched me go. Over the following 2 weeks the dynamic established itself with a patience and a lack of drama that I found genuinely restoring. In the way that a well-built machine is restoring, it worked, and it did not need to announce that it was working. The 2 larger adults held their distance. She came closer. The juveniles I did not see at dawn but began to see in the late afternoons, moving in the rift grass at the border of the field, visible in glimpses, a flicker of movement at the grass edge, a shape that was there and then not there, the particular quality of being observed by something that was not ready to be seen in return. I began to understand, in a way that I could not have articulated to anyone who had not experienced it, that I was being assessed, not threatened. Not tested in the sense of a trial with a pass or fail. Assessed in the way that a capable creature assesses anything that it has decided might be worth understanding. I think what they were trying to understand was why I was not afraid. The answer, which I never found a way to communicate to them, and which would not have been possible to communicate even if they had spoken the same language, was that I had spent 2 years being afraid of things that do not have teeth. Grief is not a predator you can sit still and outlast, but it is also not a predator you can run from, and in the processing of that discovery, I had apparently burned through whatever alarm budget I had previously maintained for physical threats. The mornings when I sat at the plot edge were the first quiet I had found since the hospital, not because nothing was there, but because what was there was paying attention to me without wanting anything from me, and I had not known until then that this was something I needed. I am not recommending grief as a wildlife management strategy. I am just saying that I was not capable, in that period of my life, of manufacturing the fear response that the Voakai seemed to be calibrating for and not finding. The Territorial Authority's first notice arrived on a Tuesday, 8 weeks after I had started sitting at the plot edge in the mornings. Overseer Brannick Yas was a broad-shouldered Heckin with 3 administrative certifications and a personal philosophy about frontier wildlife management that he was willing to share at length whether or not you had indicated interest. He was efficient and technically thorough, and held his authority the way people hold authority when they have earned it in a place where authority requires genuine effort to establish. I understood this, and I respected it, and we were entirely unable to find common ground on the question of what the Voakai's behavior meant and what ought to be done about it. He sent the notice via the standard communication system and followed it with an in-person visit to the plot within the hour, which told me he had been monitoring the perimeter sensors more closely than a routine review would require. You are required to report Volkai observations within the 50-meter buffer zone within 30 minutes of occurrence, he said, standing at my farm gate with 2 station staff members behind him and a handheld scanner that he was using to count something in the rift grass. Your sensor logs show 37 such occurrences in the past 43 days. 38, I said. You're here early. He looked at me with an expression that people use when they are trying to decide if you are being deliberately difficult or just constitutionally unorganized. I have learned to let this expression work itself out without assistance. It usually resolves itself eventually. This is a serious safety concern, he said. The Volkai pack in Zone 3 has a documented threat interaction history. 2 colonists were hospitalized in incidents in years 11 and 17 of the station's settlement. I know, I said. I read the documentation. Then you understand why the reporting protocols exist. I understand why they existed for those colonists, I said. I'm not sure they apply to my situation. This, in retrospect, was probably not the right thing to say. Yas drew himself up in the way that people with 3 administrative certifications draw themselves up when they feel their expertise is being questioned by a man with calloused hands and no certifications at all. The protocols apply to all colonists on Dust Shelf Station without exception, he said. I will need to file an observation report on your behalf for the past 38 days, and you will need to comply with the buffer zone protocols going forward. If the pack's range patterns have shifted to include your farmstead boundary, we may need to reassess your plot assignment. Reassess was a word he used the way some people use a closed fist. I understood what it meant: a different plot, away from Zone 3, further from the Riftgrass Flat, away from the mornings. Fine, I said, file the report. He filed the report. He also installed additional perimeter sensors on my eastern boundary, which I found out about when I walked outside the next morning, and one of them startled me by emitting a proximity tone at chest height. I disengaged the audio function on the ones within 20 meters of my usual sitting spot because they were disturbing the mornings, and Yas sent me a second notice about that within the day. I wrote back explaining the modification and offering to re-enable the audio if it turned out to be operationally necessary. He did not respond to the offer, which I took to mean it was not operationally necessary. The pack, as far as I could tell, was not disturbed by any of this. The sensors were placed, and the pack moved around them with the incurious efficiency of a creature that has decided what is worth its attention and what is not. By the end of the 3rd month, there were 7 adults at the plot edge at dawn on most mornings. All 6 of the pack's full adults, and one of the larger juveniles who had apparently crossed whatever threshold separated juvenile from adult in the pack's own accounting, though not in the station documentations. She still sat closest, usually at 5 or 6 meters now, close enough that on still mornings I could hear both of us breathing. The cubs, the younger juveniles, 5 of them ranging from the size of a border collie to the size of a young deer in terms of overall mass, though their build was very different from either, had begun appearing in the afternoons and staying past sunset. I found 2 of them on the porch one evening when I came back from the south end of the field and nearly stepped on the smaller one. I stood very still for a moment. The smaller one looked up at me with the alert amber eyes they all shared, measuring me the way all of them did, not with threat, with assessment. The larger one, which had been lying on its back with 2 of its limbs in the air, in a posture that I could not have predicted from the documentation, rolled upright, and looked at me too with the expression of a creature that has decided, having considered the situation, that its current location is fine and it will not be moving. I stepped around them carefully and went inside and thought about it while I made dinner, and when I came back out an hour later they were still there, the smaller one having added a position directly in front of the door that made exit somewhat deliberate. I sat on the porch step. The smaller one came and sat beside me, which I had not expected, and I made a point of not reacting to it in any way that might destabilize whatever calculation it had just completed. It was warm. Not warm in a comfortable domestic way, warm in the way of a living thing that runs a high metabolic rate and generates heat accordingly, the kind of warmth that comes from muscle and mass rather than fur. It made the quiet sound, the same one I had heard from the female on the morning she first sat close enough that I could hear her breathe. Smaller, the same cadence. Over the following weeks, the porch became part of the rotation. The mornings were the rift grass plot edge. The evenings were the porch and the farmyard. The adults held to the field perimeter with the consistent discipline of creatures that understood the difference between their space and mine. The cubs treated the farmyard as continuous with their own territory, in a way that the adults appeared to have authorized rather than merely permitted. I developed, without planning to, a working knowledge of which cub was which by gait and behavior. The smaller one, the one who had been lying on its back that first evening, I privately thought of as the bold one. It was the first to try new things, the first to approach within touching distance, the first to follow me when I moved between tasks. The others followed the bold one's lead with a lag time that decreased week by week as the novelty wore off and the routine established itself. There is a particular quality to being included in something's routine that is difficult to describe, and I think almost impossible to confuse with other things. It is not the same as being tolerated. It is not the same as being accepted in the way that a guest is accepted. It is the quality of being incorporated, factored in, planned around, expected. By the middle of the third month, the bold one expected to find me at my outdoor work table in the afternoon. It would walk from wherever it had been in the farmyard and position itself against my left leg with the efficiency of a creature executing a known sequence. If I was not at the table, it would check the porch. And if I was not on the porch, it would find me wherever I was in the farmyard and repeat the sequence. This was not training. I had done nothing to train it. It had simply decided that this was how the afternoons went. I did not name them. I want to be clear about this because people have asked. It was not that I was maintaining professional distance. I do not think I was capable of professional distance at that point, given that the bold one had taken to sitting on my boot while I did paperwork at the outdoor table. It was that naming felt like it changed what we were doing, and what we were doing seemed to be working fine without a name. The second notice from Yas arrived on a morning when all 5 cubs were on the porch. It was more formal than the first, a structured Territorial Authority complaint, with attached censor logs and a recommendation that I appear before the station's Community Safety Committee at the next scheduled meeting. The grounds were willful noncompliance with buffer zone protocols and creating conditions conducive to habituated predator behavior, constituting a safety risk to the broader colonist community. I read it carefully. I read it a second time to make sure I had understood the sections about the risk to the broader colonist community, because I wanted to know if any other colonist had reported any incident, and it turned out none had. The risk Yas was describing was theoretical, a projection of risk curves from the historical documentation applied to the current behavioral data. I understood his reasoning. The historical documentation was what it was, and a territorial authority overseer who waited for an incident to occur before acting would not remain an overseer for long. I did not agree with his conclusion, but I understood his reasoning. I went to the committee meeting. The committee was 5 people. Yas was one of them, which was not technically within the guidelines for conflict of interest management, but was the sort of thing that gets overlooked on frontier stations, where the administrative body is small enough that everyone sits on everything. The other 4 were colonists I knew to varying degrees. A woman named Petra who ran the grain cooperative and had always been direct and fair with me. 2 men from the northern plots whose names I knew, and whose faces I was slower with in the mornings. And a heckin' administrator from the commissary office who I had seen twice and who took careful notes about everything. Yas presented his case with the visual aids and the structured argument of a man who had been preparing this presentation for some time and who had done the work correctly. The sensor logs, annotated with proximity data and behavioral flags. The behavioral documentation, compared against historical Vokai data showing that habituated pack behavior in other analogous species had produced exponentially increasing risk profiles for all nearby colonists, not merely the colonist enabling the habituation. Photographs from the perimeter sensors, which were frankly better quality than I had expected, and which showed the porch cubs in considerable detail. The bold one sprawled in a characteristic position, the others distributed across the porch planking with the unself-conscious ease of creatures completely at home. I presented my case with none of those things. They're sitting on my porch, I said, not anyone else's porch. They haven't touched my crops, they haven't made any noise at night, they haven't displayed toward any of my neighbors or toward anyone who has come to the farm on ordinary business. No one has been hurt. If the risk was spreading to other colonists, I would expect some of those colonists to be here telling me about it. Petra looked at the photographs for a moment. She had the expression of someone doing arithmetic. "That's the bold one," she said, pointing to the sprawled figure, "on your boot in the later footage." "Yes," I said. "How'd it get there?" "Walked over and sat down." She looked at the photographs a moment longer, and then she looked at Yas. "Has any other colonist reported a range expansion or unusual approach behavior from the Zone 3 pack in the past 3 months?" Yas said the risk framework did not require reported incidents to justify preventive action when the behavioral trajectory indicated escalating risk. The committee did not issue a formal order that session. The commissary administrator pointed out that the existing protocols had no specific provision for the behavioral pattern being described, and that applying a habituation risk framework to what might be selective bonding behavior was a category error that ought to be reviewed before any action was taken. Yas noted that the review period was itself a source of risk. They went back and forth in the careful language of people who take their responsibilities seriously and disagree in good faith, and the meeting ended without resolution and with an escalation request on file. The escalation request triggered a 30-day review period, during which I later found out Yas contacted the station's parent authority office on the relay hub and requested deployment of the standard Vokai dispersal package, a team of 4 wildlife management technicians with sonic displacement arrays and a set of movement aversion markers designed to disrupt pack territory anchoring. Standard protocol for a habituated urban adjacent pack. He did not notify me of this. I found out because Petra, who sat on the logistics review board, saw the requisition come through and told me over the commissary counter on a Thursday morning. I asked her what the dispersal package actually did. "Sonic arrays drive them out of the zone," she said. "The movement aversion markers get set in a perimeter. They emit at a frequency the pack learns to associate with physical discomfort over repeated exposures. Takes about 2 weeks of consistent application. After that, the pack adjusts its range anchor away from the treated zone." She looked at the counter between us. "You should know the cubs respond worse than the adults. The sensory sensitivity at that developmental stage is higher." The documentation notes that cubs exposed to aversion protocols during the bonding period show lasting range aversion to the treated zone, sometimes permanently. I thought about the bold one's weight against my leg in the afternoons, and the way the female sat in the pre-dawn half-light in her spot at the grass edge and made the quiet sound. "When does the team arrive?" I said. 9 days, unless you contest the escalation request." I contested the escalation request. The xenobiologist's name was Dr. Avris Challen, and she appeared on my communication screen 2 days later looking like a person who had been doing remote assessments of frontier wildlife situations for long enough that very little surprised her anymore. though she maintained the specific alertness of someone who finds her work genuinely interesting. She wore a station research pullover and had a cup of something on her desk, and the kind of organized background that says the room is usually chaotic but has been tidied for the call. She asked me to walk her through the timeline of interactions. I did. She asked to review the full sensor logs, including the behavioral overlays that the perimeter system's tracking function generated automatically. I gave her access. She spent 40 minutes on the logs, and then came back with the expression of someone who has found something in a data set that was not supposed to be there. "The spatial pattern is unusual," she said. "Unusual how?" "The adults are maintaining a boundary. A consistent one." She pulled up a map overlay I had not seen before, not the Territorial Authority sensor map with its flags and buffer zone markings, but a movement pattern overlay derived from the tracking data across the full 3 months of observation, showing not just where the pack had been on any given morning but the aggregate shape of where they went, and more significantly, where they did not go. They're not crowding the farmstead structure. They're holding a perimeter around it. The cubs are inside the perimeter, but the adults are positioned at the boundary, not approaching. She indicated a line on the overlay. That boundary has moved twice in 3 months. Both times it moved inward toward the structure. Both movements correspond to periods of increased cub presence in the farmyard. What does that mean? It means the perimeter is dynamic. It's being maintained deliberately, not by habit. She looked at the overlay for a moment. "Mr. Saul, that formation, the way the adults are positioned around the farmstead, I've seen that in Voakai packs around a denning site. The adults hold the boundary while the cubs are inside. It's a protective formation. I've documented it 3 times in my research, always around sites the pack has identified as a location worth defending." She looked up. "I've never seen it around a human structure before." I looked at the overlay for a while. "What does that mean for the dispersal request?" I said. "It means the risk framework Yas applied was designed for habituation behavior, a pack that has lost its wariness toward the human settled zone broadly and begins approaching without discrimination. This is not that. This is the opposite of that. This pack has increased its territorial defense behavior, but the territory it's defending has shifted to include your farmstead." She paused. "Specifically, the formation anchors on your porch." "The cubs sleep on my porch," I said. "Yes," she said. "I saw the footage." She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Saul, I want to ask you something and I'd like you to answer it plainly. Have you at any point attempted to establish a bond with this pack through deliberate contact, provisioning, or behavioral conditioning?" "No," I said. "I've sat outside in the mornings. I've been quiet. Once I left a piece of dried meat on the ground near her, the female, the one who comes closest. I don't know if she took it or if something else did." "That's it. That's it." She was quiet again for longer. 82 years of documented interaction between Dust Shelf colonists and Zone 3's resident Voakai pack, she said, as if she were reading from something, though she was looking at me. 41 colonists who made deliberate attempts to establish a working relationship with this specific pack across the full history of the settlement. 11 recorded approach incidents resulting in property damage or injury. 2 hospitalizations. 0 successful voluntary bonds. "I'm aware," I said. "What's different about you?" I thought about it the way I had thought about it on the mornings at the plot edge when the question had occurred to me and I had not had a good answer. "I don't know," I said. "I wasn't trying to get anything from them. I wasn't trying to get anything from anyone. I stopped. I was having a hard year. I needed the mornings to be quiet. They were there and they were quiet too." Dr. Challant looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at her notes. Then she typed something. "I'll be submitting my assessment to the review board," she said. "My recommendation will be that the dispersal action is not proportionate to the documented behavioral profile, and that the behavioral profile does not fit the habituation risk framework the request was filed under. The pack is not showing generalized habituation. They're showing selective bonding behavior around a specific individual. The appropriate response is structured observation, not dispersal. What does Yas do with that recommendation? He can accept it, in which case the dispersal request is suspended pending a revised risk assessment. Or he can override it with a counterfiling, which would require sign-off from the regional authority director. Given the nature of my findings, particularly the protective formation data, it would be unusual for a director to sign off on a dispersal action without ordering a site visit first. She looked at me with the expression of a person who has more to say and is deciding whether to say it. Mr. Saul, the formation the adults are holding around your farmstead, the perimeter around the porch. Yes, I said. When a Volkai pack takes a denning formation around a site, holds the boundary, positions the adults, keeps the cubs inside the perimeter, the pack will defend that site from perceived threats. That's what the formation means. It's not passive. The adults aren't just sitting at your field boundary because they find it comfortable. She let that settle. The dispersal team are going to be perceived as a threat to that site. Yes, I said, that's what I'm worried about. That's what I'm going to put in the report. She ended the call. I went outside. The bold one was on the porch in its preferred afternoon posture, lying on its back with two limbs in the air in a state of such complete physical ease that it seemed to have dissolved partway into the planking. I sat on the step and looked at the field. The female was visible at the grass edge, her usual spot, sitting in the observing posture even though it was mid-afternoon rather than dawn. She looked at me and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything, which was how we had always done it. Yas did not accept Dr. Challen's recommendation. He filed a counter-argument. The counter-argument did not reach the regional authority director because it required the support of the majority of the Community Safety Committee, and Petra voted against supporting it, and the committee split 2-2 with Yas's own vote as the fifth, which the committee charter designated as a conflict of interest, and the counter-argument therefore did not proceed through the correct channel. The dispersal team arrived anyway. This, I later found out, was because Yas had refiled the dispersal request directly through the station management channel rather than the Community Safety Committee channel, arguing that a procedural overlap between Dr. Challen's assessment timeline and the expiration of his original escalation authorization created a window under which the station management office could authorize deployment without committee approval. It was technically legal under the station's foundational charter in the way that many things are technically legal, that are also clearly contrary to the intent of the people who wrote the charter. I found out the team had arrived when I heard the transit shuttle at the northern landing pad at mid-morning, which was unusual, and walked out of the farmhouse to see what it was. The team was 4 technicians in Territorial Authority environmental suits, carrying 3 sonic displacement arrays on wheeled carriers and a sealed case of movement aversion markers. They were walking from the landing pad toward my plot with Yas in front, moving with the efficiency of people executing a prepared operational plan. It was mid-morning. The sun was high, and the Rift Grass Flat was bright, and the Theron Bluffs were clear on the horizon. It was, in other words, a perfectly ordinary morning on Dust Shelf Station, except for the 4 people walking toward my farm with dispersal equipment. The cubs were in the farmyard, all 5 of them, spread across the yard in their afternoon arrangement, the bold one against the gate post, 2 others in a loose pair near the water trough where the shadow was good, the remaining 2 at the far end near the east wall. It was the posture they used when the day was unremarkable, and there was nothing in particular to pay attention to. The adults were not in the farmyard. They were not visible. I walked out to meet Yas at the gate and did not look for them, because I knew that looking was not going to tell me anything the next few minutes would not clarify on its own. "You don't have committee approval," I said. "I have station management authorization," Yas said. "The procedural review is complete. The dispersal action proceeds." He was looking past me at the farmyard. One of the technicians behind him had slowed his pace. Another had turned to say something quiet to the one who had slowed. "Mr. Saul, I need you to step aside. The displacement arrays need to be positioned within the Zone 3 boundary perimeter to be effective." "The Zone 3 boundary perimeter is inside my farm," I said. "The station's resettlement agreements reserve the right to conduct wildlife management activities within colonist-adjacent zones when—" He stopped. I turned around. They were there, all 6 of them, at the farmyard boundary, at the exact line I had come to recognize as the line they held, the perimeter edge of the formation Dr. Challen had mapped. They had come from the rift grass the way they always came, without sound and without signal, and they were there the way a wall is there. The female with the uneven gait was at the center. The 2 largest adults were flanking her, positioned slightly forward. The other 3 were spread to either side, and the one recent juvenile who had been added to the boundary formation in the past weeks was at the far right. All of them were sitting. All of them were upright in the observing posture, 2 upper limbs braced forward, weight settled, faces forward, eyes on the group at the gate. Nobody moved. I counted the seconds in my head because I needed something to do with my attention while I stood in the middle of what was happening. I got to 23 before one of the technicians said something quiet to Yas that I did not hear clearly. Yas said something back. The technician said something else. His voice was low and he was keeping it professionally flat, but I know what careful sounds like. "Yas," I said without turning around, "how close do the arrays need to be to the pack to be effective?" There was a pause of the kind that happens when someone is doing a calculation they would prefer not to share. "Within 30 meters of the primary subjects." "The pack is at the farmyard boundary. What's the distance from here to the farmyard boundary?" Another pause. "Approximately 25 meters. The female with the uneven gait made a sound. Not the quiet sound from the mornings, the other sound, the one that came from deeper and had a different character entirely, a sound with weight and intention in it the way a very large door has weight when it moves. The 2 largest adults shifted their weight forward onto their front limbs without standing, which was a movement I had not seen before and which did not require any documentation to interpret. Their eyes stayed on the technicians. Their posture was, for the first time in my experience of them, not an observing posture. It was something else. The bold one walked across the farmyard and sat down at my feet. It just walked over and sat down, the way it always did, with the casual completeness of a creature for whom this is simply the correct place to be. It looked up at me with its amber eyes and made the quiet sound. I looked down at it. Then I looked back at the farmyard, where the other 4 cubs had risen from their various positions and were moving toward me in a loose cluster, and then they were at my feet too, arranged around the bold one and around me, not touching, but close, all of them making the quiet sound in a low common register, a sound like a machine running right. Behind me, I heard Yas say something about redeployment protocols. I heard one of the technicians say something about assessment windows and the operational parameters of the authorization. I heard a 4th voice, which I thought was one of the technicians, say something I did not catch, and then silence. I did not turn around. The female with the uneven gait looked at me across the farmyard. She had been looking at me from various distances for 6 months. I had never been able to read her face in any way I could confidently call accurate, because I was not qualified to read Volkai faces, and the documentation's ethological descriptions were not useful at the level of a specific individual in a specific moment. But she looked at me the way she had looked at me from the plot edge in those early weeks, steadily, without urgency, as if this was a morning like any other morning, as if the correct thing was simply to sit in her place and wait. I sat down on the ground, the way I always sat in the mornings, because my back was bothering me and because it was the right thing to do. The bold one climbed partway onto my leg immediately, which was something it had started doing 2 weeks ago, and which I had not done anything to encourage or discourage. The others settled around me. I looked at the rift grass flat and the bluffs beyond it, brilliant in the mid-morning sun, and listened to Yas and his team discuss their situation behind me with the careful voices of people who have just realized that their operational parameters do not match the operational reality. The dispersal team did not deploy the arrays that morning. They returned to the transit shuttle with the equipment on their wheeled carriers and departed within the hour. Yas filed a formal incident report, which was required under station management protocols when a planned wildlife management action could not be completed as authorized. The incident report described, in his precise administrative language, that the Volkai pack had occupied a position constituting a barrier to equipment deployment, rendering the action incompletable without a direct approach to the occupied zone that fell outside the scope of the operational authorization. The incident report went into the station record. The station record went to the quarterly review, which happened 6 weeks later. The quarterly review was attended by a representative from the Regional Authority Director's office, because Dr. Challant had followed up her original assessment with a second filing describing the formation behavior she had documented, the protective perimeter, the boundary holding, the cub placement around the colonist, and flagging it as a behavioral event of xenobiological significance requiring regional oversight. The director's representative was a woman named Sorvian who had been working in regional authority oversight for 20 years and who read incident reports the way experienced people read incident reports, not for what they said, but for what they were careful not to say. She read Yas's incident report and Dr. Challant's assessments, and the sensor logs and the behavioral overlay map, and then she visited my farm. I made coffee. She declined it politely and asked to see the farmyard. We stood at the farmyard gate and looked at the 5 cubs distributed across the yard. The female with the uneven gait was at the rift grass boundary in her observing posture. 2 other adults were visible at the grass edge. "How long has this been happening?" Sorvian asked. 6 months, I said. "Have you attempted to discourage it?" "No, have I been required to?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "The resettlement agreement doesn't require colonists to actively discourage voluntary wildlife approach behavior. Yas's protocols apply when a human is encouraging habituation. There's no existing protocol that applies when the habituation appears to be self-initiated by the wildlife. The bold one had come to the gate when it noticed me there. It sat at the gate post and looked at Sorvian with the steady attentiveness that all of them had and that I had stopped noticing because it was simply part of the day. She looked back at it for a moment. The incident report. Yas describes the pack as occupying a position that prevented equipment deployment. Yes. They were sitting down. Yes. She looked at the cubs for a while. The behavioral literature on Volkai, she said, has approximately 215 published analyses. I've read a fair portion of it. I cannot find a single documented instance of a Zone 3 pack approaching a colonist structure and establishing a protective formation around it without a provocation event on record or a deliberate bonding attempt by the colonist. She looked at me. "What's your theory about why this one did?" I was quiet, I said. "I think they figured out I wasn't going to try anything." She considered this. Then she asked me to walk her through the full timeline, the same way Dr. Challant had. I did. She took notes with the compact efficiency of a person who has done this many times. At the end, she said, "The dispersal action will be formally suspended. Yas's station management authorization will be reviewed at this quarterly assessment. The procedural channel he used to circumvent the committee conflict of interest provision will be specifically reviewed. You will need to cooperate with Dr. Challant's ongoing behavioral observation program. In exchange, the buffer zone reporting requirement will be modified to reflect the documented behavioral pattern rather than the standard protocol." She closed her notebook. In 82 years, we have not had a voluntary pack bond with a colonist on this station. We have had approaches. We have had incidents. We have had a great deal of careful documentation about why it does not happen and what the risk profile looks like when it is attempted. She looked at the bold one at the gate post, unhurried, sitting in the way it always sat when I was in its vicinity. We don't have a category for this. No, I said, I noticed. She left. Yas's station management authorization was reviewed, and he was formally censured for the procedural channel he had used, which the review found to be a circumvention of the intent of the conflict of interest provision, even if it was technically permissible under the Charter's original language. He remained Territorial Authority overseer because there was no one else qualified to do the job, but the censure went into the record, and the Regional Director's Office established an oversight position for Zone 3 wildlife management that reported directly to Dr. Challant rather than to Yas. I am told he found this arrangement deeply unsatisfying. I have not verified this personally because I have not spoken to Yas at length since the morning his dispersal team stood at my gate and then walked back to their shuttle. I do not carry any particular feeling about his dissatisfaction. I have enough to think about. Dr. Challant's behavioral observation program has produced, as of the date I am writing this, 4 published analyses of the Zone 3 PAC's interaction pattern with my farmstead. I have read all 4. They are careful and precise, and they describe what has happened in language that makes it sound more significant than it felt from inside it, which may be accurate and may just be the nature of scientific prose. The 4th analysis introduced a term for the formation pattern, the distributed positioning of the adults at the boundary, reorienting toward me as a specific anchor point. She calls it a refuge anchor response. She notes in the text that it has not been documented in any prior study of this or any analogous species, and she notes in a footnote that it cannot be replicated by other colonists attempting the same behavioral approach, even when those colonists follow the same minimal contact protocol. Sitting quietly at a distance, making no direct approach, maintaining calm and consistent presence. I did not tell her what I think the difference is, because I did not think it was something that would survive the translation into a paper. But I think the pack understood something that I was not trying to communicate and that I was not capable of hiding, which is that I was not there because I wanted something from them. I was there because I had run out of reasons to be anywhere else with any urgency, and the mornings at the plot edge were a place where the quiet was not empty, where something was paying attention to the same horizon I was paying attention to, without wanting me to be different than I was. The bold one is no longer the smallest of the cubs. That has changed in 6 months in a way that genuinely startles me when I look at the early sensor footage and compare it to the animal that comes to the gate every evening. It has grown in the way of a thing that was always going to be large but was simply not there yet, and the casual way it sits against my leg in the afternoons has the additional weight of a creature that now outmasses me considerably and appears entirely unaware of this fact. The others have grown in proportion, and the farmyard in the evenings has a different quality than it did in the early months, more deliberate, more coherent, a thing that is arranged with intention rather than simply distributed by proximity. I wrote to Mavi about it after the quarterly review. He wrote back with one practical question and one question that was actually an observation, the way he always does, which is something he learned from his mother. The practical question was whether I needed him to come home. The observation was, "You sound like yourself again." I wrote back and told him I did not need him to come, but that I would like him to visit when he had leave, because there was someone I wanted him to meet. I have since reconsidered the phrasing, and I think someone was the right word, and I will leave it there. The mornings are still the best part. I wake before dawn and make the coffee and walk out to the plot edge, and the female with the uneven gait is there in her spot at the grass edge, sitting in the half-light with her 2 upper limbs braced and her face forward, the same posture she has held every morning for 6 months. We watch the sun come up over the Theron Bluffs together. She makes the quiet sound sometimes. I do not know what to call it, and I have stopped needing to know. The bluffs turn red and then gold, and then the ordinary color of a clear morning, and the rift grass moves in the early wind that comes off the rock, and the station's lights somewhere behind me cycle through the dawn sequence, and neither of us needs anything from the other. They called it unprecedented in the papers, a behavioral anomaly, a category that did not previously exist. Dr. Challant's fourth analysis ends with a section titled Implications for Resettlement Protocol Review that is measured and careful, and which recommends, in the qualified language of someone who is aware that her data is strange, that existing frameworks for assessing human-wildlife interaction on frontier resettlement stations may need revision to account for contact patterns that are initiated by the wildlife rather than by the colonist. I called it Tuesday and Wednesday, and every morning after that the same as any other morning because that is what it was. The pack called it theirs,